So yeah, I'm really excited. Well, I'm excited to talk to you all on behalf of Built Buildings Lab today, not just the ZNCC co-chair. I'm here with Billie Faircloth, and we're going to lead you all in a bit of a discussion around the role of policy in advancing existing and historic buildings as climate action and climate justice. There's been a lot of movement in policy areas lately, and we thought that the ZNCC would be a really wonderful place to convene a conversation about what this community's role can be in advancing this policy landscape. All right. So I'm going to hand it off to Billie Faircloth to do a bit of an introduction of the Built Buildings Lab.
Yeah, hi everyone. Billie Faircloth. I also just want to say I'm the research director at Built Buildings Lab. I am no longer with Karen Timberlake. I just want to make that clear to everyone. I know for those of you who know me, they're aware of that transition. But I wanted to just briefly introduce and give you a sneak peek in what we're doing with regards to this new nonprofit platform that is in fact in the process of forming. So today we are convening a conversation on policy, as Lori mentioned, but we are building up a platform to accelerate knowledge of built buildings as a necessary climate solution to increase their visibility and their representation at all levels of climate action. So as we form this nonprofit, we will have more to share about all of the types of research that we anticipate doing. And we'll have more to share about the ways in which we are working to advance storytelling on existing buildings, advance advocacy of existing buildings as a climate solution. But right now we are simply forming. So this is just a tiny sneak peek of the types of things that we imagine doing, and we look forward to a future where we can be more say forthcoming in all the things that we are planning right now. Lori's going to tell you more though.
I am. I'll share our objectives with you. So we do have objectives around that mission, working with our different, working with different audiences. Firstly, starting with communities to support their work in caring for their own buildings. Again, identifying those knowledge gaps and really working on filling knowledge gaps, generating new knowledge to really support existing buildings as climate solutions, making sure that existing buildings are represented in climate policies, frameworks, and guidelines, really working to reveal our attitudes and perceptions around how we care for existing buildings, how we maintain them, how we use them over time. And then demonstrating the co-benefits of existing and historic buildings, which I know this group really understands that it's not just an environmental argument, that there are so many co-benefits associated with our existing built environment and caring for it. All right, so moving into our purpose here today, what we'd like to do is to have a discussion with you all to advance our collective understanding and curiosity on the role of policies at the intersection of existing buildings and climate action. So we're going to have a brief presentation and then do some work, some conversations together. And we're going to look at existing buildings in climate policy, the inverse of that, the role of climate in preservation policy, and then how we can use all of these policies together to advance existing buildings. Okay, we're going to start with a quick poll though. So in the Zoom chat, we would like to hear your thoughts on what positive impacts existing and historic structures have to bring to building climate action and climate policy. So I'm going to give everyone a second, just a couple of words. Let me open up the chat. Okay, we've got a few around culture and ethos of repair and care, embodied carbon, history and legacy, a lot of embodied carbon, cultural anchors, embodied wisdom. This is great. Okay, I don't want to, okay. Yes, evidence of building types that are durable, speediest route to net zero. Knowledge of passive strategies. Yes. Okay, these are great. I'm going to show you, feel free to keep adding some. And I asked this question, Jean Caroon was in the room. I see you, Jean. In Paris at the Buildings and Climate Global Forum hosted by the United Nations Environment Program. We hosted, I was one of the co-hosts through the Climate Heritage Network and Architecture 2030 of the session on heritage structures. We asked the same question there. And I think we got a lot of very similar responses that existing and historic buildings are so powerful with climate action as a strategy because they don't just address the environment, although they do. They have a tremendous amount of avoided carbon. They do provide the fastest way to net zero, but they also come along with all these co-benefits, including heritage value and knowledge and wisdom and durability and all the things that you all are talking about. So that's wonderful. And one other thing that I think helps kind of frame this conversation is that when we were planning the event, this was a chart that is very complex to read. This was given to all of the organizers, the session organizers at this global building forum to talk about building policy. And you can see on the left all of the themes that were going to be discussed, and on the right are these priority policy recommendations. And at the bottom, my little box, at the bottom you can see, is it animated? Hold on. Yeah, there, heritage buildings is unmapped. That it's obviously important. People know this is important to address, to talk about heritage buildings. We're in the room, but there's just not a great vocabulary, a really common understanding of why they're important and how they map across different policy priorities. So that's part of why we're here, is to help with this mapping and for us to all have a common language to really talk about this. So I'm going to briefly share a few policy trends that I think are pertinent to this conversation and really create a lot of opportunities for advocacy within the community. Going back to that Buildings and Climate Global Forum, the outcome of that was the Declaration de Chaillot, which was a common framework agreed to by over 70 governments that created essentially a roadmap to a decarbonized and resilient built environment. And what was really exciting is that this is firstly the first time that the UN scale has started to create agreements across all of these countries to address the built environment, but more importantly, that reuse, repair, care, traditional knowledge, local know-how, as they call it, are showing up in the language, that there's sort of a recognition that everyone creating climate policies for the built environment needs to address these existing buildings and the knowledge that comes with them. That global policy then starts to trickle down to provide a kind of common framework for federal governments to advance their own policies. So many of you have likely seen this new federal national definition of zero emissions buildings from the US government, which the development was led by the White House with input from many built environment stakeholders. And what this did is create a common, again, a common way to measure and define how we're going to advance action in the built environment. And that did include requirements for existing buildings, which is good, not exempt. And it essentially sets out different criteria that existing buildings have to meet. I'll note that this is part one because it includes only operational emissions. So I think the White House, the federal government, acknowledges that this is not a holistic definition of zero emissions. There are a group of us, I think many people actually advocating for the inclusion of embodied carbon into this policy to start to create a true zero emissions building definition. But for now, this is what we have. And it advocate for high performing existing buildings, which is, I think, a really positive thing to bring existing buildings forward and to keep them relevant. Again, on the flip side, that was sort of existing in historic buildings in climate policy. We're also starting to see climate coming into preservation policy in many ways, but one example is through the ACHP's actions and documents over the past couple of years, including this report on climate change and historic preservation, which basically puts out policy principles that include gathering information about the impact of climate on existing buildings and the benefits of heritage buildings on climate, talks about planning and mitigation strategies, as well as education to really support heritage buildings in adapting to climate and to being leveraged as assets in climate action. So that's just a little bit of context of where policies are, at least at the international and national level. And I know that many of you are working at the local level within policies as well. So I'm going to hand it over to Billie to describe what we're going to do next.
Thanks, Lori. I was really curious first before we shift to the discussion. If you think about the 3 examples that we brought forward, are there any questions, points of clarification, or maybe additional knowledge around those policies that anyone wants to investigate a little bit before we move to discussion?